think we're gonna be live here.
Okay.
It says it's streaming. Boom, and we are live. What's up, friends? I'm with my friend Dr. John Limansky.
What's going on, guys?
Gonna take your questions and talk about all things keto. Let me just make sure we're on, Dr. John.
Yep.
And there we are on YouTube. We have some friends here already.
Thanks, guys.
What do you know?
Yeah.
That's great. Well, we had a good day on Sunday. Tech-free day. We were
Yes.
paddleboarding. We went hiking. I didn't ask you. Did you have breakfast that day?
No.
So you're fasted too.
I fast, yeah. Generally, what I'll do in the morning is, butter, a little MCT in my coffee.
Nice.
And then fast for most of the day and then have a really good meal at the end of the day.
So you're kind of like a 1 meal a day type?
Usually. And that meal is usually pretty solid. I
Yeah.
mean, like 2,500 calories.
Nice.
So I try to time it so that after I'm really active throughout the day, I actually use that energy.
Yeah.
Some people will say, eat in the morning because you're going to burn through that fuel throughout the day. I have found for myself, I tend to get a little bit, fatigued after eating a big meal.
Kind of bogged down.
Yeah. So for me, it works a little bit better that way.
Yeah. So I would resonate with that. I think sometimes it depends when I lift or
Yep.
type of exercise that I'm doing. But the reason why I was kind of curious on that is because maybe 10 years ago, if we were to do that same, and just for y'all listening and stuff like that, it wasn't too vigorous. It was like a family hike.
Yep.
Let the kids play, went paddleboarding, went kayaking. But it was like constant activity.
Yeah. For like 5-6 hours.
Yeah.
At least, yeah.
I mean, pre-keto, you would be like,
Oh, yeah.
Where's my apple? Where's my energy bar? Whatever,
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I would be packed with so I used to do kind of semi-professional triathlons. I mean, I would have gels, I would have bars, I would have sports drinks. I mean, I was basically dependent on sugar at that point.
Yeah.
And now I can go, 12 hours, pretty strenuous hikes and feel great because I'm keto adapted.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's all the benefits that people that are in the know. So we have a lot of friends hopping on, guys. Really appreciate that. We're streaming this live if you're listening to the replay in iTunes. So we're right on. It's about a week out or so from the Lancet article. It was a recent prospective cohort study / meta-analysis. And we're hearing that the ketogenic diet or low-carb diets are going to shorten your lifespan. But yet, people like you and I who have come from the high-carb world realize that, we feel so much better. So why is there this almost it's a big discrepancy, it seems like.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because as a physician, this is something that I battle with all the time. Because when you look at headlines, so if you go to CNN, the headline's going to be low carb is going to kill you, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so how many people actually read through the article and look to see, okay, what's this based on? I would say probably not many people. And if you do read it, well, then you have to go into kind of the research, and the research is going to be, as you mentioned, a cohort study or, a prospective study. And those things are basically, I'm going to call up 10, 15 people and say, what'd you eat for the last week? So
I think I had 3. I can't remember.
Yeah, right. So how many people remember what they ate yesterday, let alone, a week ago? Yeah. And so then based on those studies or those surveys, they'll say, there's an association with, mortality or some sort of morbidity, cardiovascular disease tends to be the major one. And then they'll make an inference and say, well, because these people are low carb and because they've had heart attacks more often, then there's an association. But it's hard to take that and make it a causation, saying that low carb is actually going to decrease your lifespan. Yeah. And then you counterbalance that with, number one, how you feel. So I've been low carb, I've been keto for about 14, 15 years. Nice. And then my lab values are all, phenomenal. I'm going to be 40 next month.
Nice.
And so I have more energy, I'm stronger, I have more mental clarity now than I did when I was in my 20s. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to really look at those studies and say they're accurate, and then also look at how I feel, my lab values, which I think from my perspective is a lot more valuable than what some cohort study is going to say.
Right. Where in this fine print, you have to actually go into the research and read there's 70% of that, one of the quintiles, were smokers.
Yeah.
Past or current or past smokers.
Right.
And so you don't hear about some of these other factors. Anyway, that's just one example of many.
Yeah, a good example too is like with the Dean Ornish studies. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you take what he does, which is now really the only program that's paid for by Medicare for people who have heart failure or heart disease, they take away smoking. They take away, or they add exercise, they add meditation. And then they say, well, it's really the low-fat perspective that's actually causing all these benefits. And the question then becomes, well, how can you say that when you have all these other variables that you're taking out? Because we know that if you stop smoking, you don't have to be a physician to know that that's going to increase your lifespan, right? And so it's that fine detail that we, especially now in the Twitter kind of universe, we don't look at. And so unfortunately for us, we are battling this perspective where that's going to be what people are going to remember, are the headlines. And so I have so many email questions saying, hey, you're saying keto is healthy, but this is what CNN is saying. And that's a big battle. That's difficult to battle.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, people, because CNN's on in the background. Like you go to the airport. I mean, a lot of people's homes, workplaces. Okay, so let's rewind the clock before, now you're doing a lot of like telemedicine and like concierge type practice. You're a physician. Board certified in internal medicine?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So let's say that you set up shop and you were seeing clients, seeing patients, and you're super busy. You're seeing what, 15, 30 people a day roughly? Yeah,
I would say average primary care doc is going to see probably 25 to 30 patients a day.
So you don't have time. So you got to like chart after seeing all those patients.
Correct.
So you're super busy is what I'm trying to establish here.
Yep.
A headline comes out like this in the Lancet. Are you going to take the time to read the full thing? Or maybe you would because you're Dr. John.
Yep.
But most docs, are they going to read the full article or just like the abstract?
So as a physician, especially if you want to maintain your board certification, you have to do continuing medical education. And these are a lot of the conferences that guys go to. And I would say that probably the majority are going to get their up-to-date information at those conferences, not by reading journal articles, especially not from CNN. Maybe they get, JAMA or Lancet or one of these big, New England Journal of Medicine magazines, and then, read through those. But most of them are now drug studies.
Yeah.
So that's the majority of articles that we get in those publications are going to be this drug versus placebo or this drug versus the standard drug of care. Nutritional studies are really not the focus for a number of reasons, but I think number one, it's really hard to account for all the other variables if you're doing a nutritional study. And then it's really hard because there's no money. So there's no profitability for drug companies, and that's really what the advertisement's going to be.
Right.
So you don't get much in terms of nutritional studies.
So basically, you would rely upon most doctors will and nurse practitioners, PAs, rely upon the abstract, and then when Sally Smith comes in, she's lost weight on keto, they say, you probably shouldn't do that. Yeah, right.
And the biggest issue, I think, with keto, because every doctor will agree you should eat real food. I don't think there's a doctor out there that's going to say, go to McDonald's or fast food and eat junk food. Yeah. But the question, really the crux of the issue with keto, I think from a medical perspective, is a saturated fat component. So we're still at the point where we think saturated fat causes heart disease. And until we get beyond that, it's going to be hard for just your general practitioner or your nurse practitioner to say, you know what, it's okay to do keto despite the fact that there's saturated fat in it.
Now, is there any truth to that in your eyes? And not that the simplistic view, fat is like this plumber pipe model and it clogs your arteries, but there was a study, I think it was in JAMA actually, and it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial. I think it came out in May, where it did show higher levels of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis formation, like the streaks within the liver in people that have, I think it was a controlled trial. So, I mean, is there any links there? Are you ever cautious about high saturated fat diets?
Yeah, there are some people who cannot tolerate high saturated fats. So they can tolerate a little bit better in terms of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fats. And that tends to be when more of the Mediterranean diet perspective works better, where you're taking most of your fats from, olive oils, olives, avocados, maybe some form of seeds. Maybe you want to back away from saturated fats. There are some SNPs that you have to be concerned about. But I would say that's a very small percentage of the population. And really the best way to do that is to do the ketogenic diet and then measure your lab values in terms of lipid profile. But do it more specific in terms of an NMR LipoProfile, because that'll give you a better estimation of LP little a, LDL particle numbers and sizes. And then you can make an inference saying, okay, if your numbers get way out of whack and you're doing a very high saturated fat diet, then you probably want to back off and probably preferentially do more of a monounsaturated. I personally actually do a variety of fats. I don't think that I do as well when I'm just saturated fat predominant.
I think that's smart. I mean, and that makes sense to me if you think about it just from an evolutionary perspective. It's not like you're going to have the same thing every single day, right?
Right, and that's kind of one of the things I'm a little bit concerned about the MCT that's coming out because I think MCTs can be very, very beneficial, and I personally use them. So medium chain triglycerides, preferentially, you're not going to actually store them as fat. You'll burn them preferentially as energy and make ketones, so you get a little boost in terms of brain cognition. But then the question becomes, if that becomes your predominant fat, which I see a lot of people are doing because they're doing kind of the bulletproof coffee 3-4 times a day, then I wonder, is that evolutionary, something that we really didn't know?
Yeah.
And so that's the balance I think we're at right now with kind of the ketogenic movement, is that how do you optimize it for yourself? And that's why I'm a big proponent of data tracking, so that because weight is obviously a great barometer of success. And I know a lot of people get into it because they want to, lose a certain amount of weight. But then you got to kind of go beyond that and say, okay, that weight will come off, but then if I stagnate or if I plateau, there might be other variables that are causing you to plateau, and some of that might be the types of fat that you're consuming.
That's key. I would love to dive into that. But you did mention for yourself earlier that you've been keto for 14, 15 years, and your biomarkers are great. And I didn't want to interrupt you. What biomarkers in particular did you look at for yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a data nerd, and so I do a lot of markers. But I think in terms of the most valuable markers, so number one, the simplest would just be a fasting glucose. So I think that gives you a tremendous amount of information beyond anything else, and it's simple. You can do it at home. It's a little pinprick. You don't really have to worry about it. You and I have done like the continuous glucose monitors, which to me is invaluable. I think it's probably one of the best tests you can do. But let's say you go to your lab and you're going to get routine lab work. So fasting insulin, I would say, is one of the most important. And people will say, well, fasting insulin is great, but also like a 2-hour, 3-hour postprandial challenge will also be very valuable, because you'll understand how much your body is going to produce in response to a specific glucose load. There's a lot of kind of variables in terms of checking insulin, depending on the time you take it, which arm you take it from. So you can get a lot of different values. So that's the problem with insulin right now. But I think overall, like right now, my insulin is 2. My fasting insulin is 2. Yeah. So essentially, I'm producing a basal amount that I need, and I definitely don't have insulin resistance. High sensitive CRP. So you and me were more into biohacking, kind of optimizing everything in our life beyond just nutrition, right? Yeah. And I know you talk a lot about sleep, a lot about stress reduction, a lot of things, light exposure, because nutrition is probably, I would say, about 70% of the answer to our health issues. But then you have to take into account, if you're driving on the 405 freeway in traffic for 2 hours a day, your stress levels are going to be through the roof, your cortisol is going to be high, and that's going to be reflected in a CRP. Yeah. And so if you're doing everything right nutritionally and your CRP is still really high, well, then you have to think what other factors are influencing that. I know you've been changing out your carpet and putting in floor. So mold exposure can cause a systemic inflammatory response, and that can influence cortisol level, which can influence insulin level, and maybe make it harder for you to lose weight. Working late at night, eating late at night, all those things can really drive cortisol production, and that can, stall you out in terms of weight loss. I mentioned the NMR LipoProfile, which I think is extremely important, just because in terms of the influence of cholesterol, not so much in cardiovascular disease, but just overall health. And so things like triglyceride levels, I'd look at preferentially. I do look at LDLp, particle size and particle number. And I use that a lot to kind of guide small changes dietary-wise. So like I mentioned before, if people are really high in saturated fats, but their particle numbers are going through the roof, and they have, very high levels of LP(a), then I might switch it up a little bit to more of a monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fat.
So just change the fat type.
Correct.
Not really go back to high carb, low fat, but just switch it around. Yeah.
I don't want to say never, because I never like to say never, but I would say there's probably never have I asked somebody to go high carb, low fat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There is some different gene SNPs. I know you alluded to some, and I was reading some research on this about a year ago. Individuals from Portugal and Saudi Arabia. I think this is the HMG-CoA synthase or HMG-CoA lyase. I can't remember which one. And that's kind of the rate-limiting enzyme that makes ketones within the liver.
Right.
They have a very sluggish version of that. So that might be a person where maybe for them a higher MCT oil diet, like you were saying.
Yeah, or I've been playing around myself with exogenous ketones. I don't think it's for everybody, but maybe in that situation, maybe doing a little exogenous ketones to help with, brain health and cognition, maybe something to consider.
Yeah. Now, when you toy with them, do you add them in with MCT oil or by themselves? And
I've tried both. So I've tried just the straight exogenous ketones. I've tried the ketone esters, which are probably the worst. Yeah. Might as well just go get some moonshine. It's the most disgusting thing. And then I've done a combination of exogenous and MCT powders. And I think that's probably the one that I feel is the best because it gives you a short burst from the exogenous ketones, which have a very short half-life. And then the MCT will give you kind of a delayed effect. But again, I don't think it's something I would substitute for nutrition. Like I think if you're dialed in and you just kind of want a little extra boost, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, I think it's good to, my mindset on it is to get the buy-in from someone.
Right.
Maybe, your Uncle Tom, he doesn't want to get rid of his French fries and stuff like that. You're like, all right, well, just try this and see how more energetic you'll feel. It'll curb those cravings, and to convince them that they should do the lifestyle change.
Yeah, and a lot of times I'll use it for fasting. So some people will have a hard time. I promote, doing extended fasting, 5 to 7 days. I personally do it probably every 3 months. Wow. And so for some people, just that transition to do a longer term fasting helps if you have a little bit of the exogenous ketone MCT. And from a caloric standpoint, you're really not pushing the envelope.
Right.
The flip side is people will say, well, maybe you're not getting the autophagy that you want. There's no research either way.
Right.
So I think if it helps people get through that transition period, the first couple days, I think it's worthwhile.
I have a paper lying around here. It's actually right over there.
Yeah.
About autophagy and exercise.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that you mentioned the calorie kind of the calorie bolus maybe,
right,
or the nutritional bolus would potentially slow down autophagy. But if you look at the Prolon product, that's just like very low calorie,
right,
and they're doing research on that, and Vulture Longo is promoting that. So I think that, like you said, a little bit of MCT, a little ketone to help get you through. And if you scoot over a little bit, we're in the frame.
Yeah.
Super interesting. So that's an application of that. Let's talk about hormones, because one of the arguments, and I don't know where this came from. I was Nisha and I were going back and forth on Instagram about thyroid, and if you have Hashimoto's or whatever, you shouldn't do keto. They say, what's up with that?
Yeah, so we're actually going to be talking about iodine later today, and so it's a good transition. But so when we talk about hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, a lot of it is a systemic inflammation. So it's driven by either some form of antibodies, whether they're causing hypo or hyperthyroidism. That's the majority of people. And so then the question becomes, what's actually the underlying process that's driving those antibodies? And a lot of times it's nutritional. And so if you believe in the leaky gut syndrome theory, where basically because we're eating processed food, because they're full of glyphosate, destroying the actual gut lining, and so we're absorbing these large proteins that we normally shouldn't absorb. So our gut are very, very particular about what we absorb, and that's going to be very, very small particles. So glucose, amino acids, and different fats. But once you kind of what I call Velcro, so the cells are basically attached by Velcro, and when you get rid of those, the tight junctions, now all of a sudden you allow these large foreign bodies to come into the bloodstream. And your body doesn't like that. And so it forms antibodies. And then those antibodies sometimes mimic thyroid production. And so you'll have an attack on your thyroid, either to produce more thyroid or less thyroid hormone. Now, when you go keto, and if you do it the right way, basically what you're doing is you're allowing your gut to heal, because you're getting rid of all the grains, all the products that are full of glyphosate, all the processed food. You allow the gut to heal. You allow the gut microbe to regenerate. And now all of a sudden, you don't have this autoimmune response anymore. So in my experience, I've found that most people who have a hypothyroid, which is pretty prevalent in our society now, actually do tremendously better. So they actually do better. They can lower their thyroid medication. Symptomology-wise, they feel much better. They're not having the symptoms of hypothyroidism, which I would say is predominant versus hyperthyroidism for most people.
Yeah.
And you'll find that their antibodies will actually start decreasing pretty precipitously. So I will say that some people who are hardcore keto for extended period of time, maybe combine that with some caloric restriction, may have a little bit too much of a stressor on their body in terms of cortisol production, thyroid production. But that's pretty simple by just doing a little recycle where you introduce a little bit more carbohydrates, healthy ones, right? The other thing that I think is a key component of the hormonal aspect is the micronutrients. And so one of the things that I'm really trying to push in terms of getting the information out there, and I know you do a very good job of this, is you can do keto and still not get the micronutrients that you want.
Yeah.
So a good example would be going to a fast food restaurant, getting a double, triple cheeseburger, taking the bun off, and saying, well, this is keto.
It must be healthy.
It must be healthy, right? And so initially, you'll lose weight. You might feel a little bit better, but then inevitably, most people will stall out. Yeah. And that's because there's really no nutrient density in the food. And so a lot of the enzymes that we need in our body, especially to make ATP, energy production in the mitochondria, require micronutrients. So things like selenium, zinc, even things like magnesium. And if you're not getting that from the food that you're consuming, then you're probably not going to be as healthy or feel as good.
Such a great point.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think for some reason that point was underscored or tacitly understood in the paleo community. Right? Like you didn't see a lot of people go to Wendy's and say, hey, I'm eating paleo.
Right.
But we see that more in the keto, and that's kind of why I poke fun. Not that I don't think the carnivore can be healthy and helpful for people. I think it is, especially when you're talking about leaky gut and everything. I think that's the ultimate elimination diet. But then we see so many people going to Wendy's having the triple, quadruple burger and saying they're carnivore, but you're kind of missing the point. So what do we need to do to, kickstart this movement in the keto community? I'm sure you have a book coming out, but what else?
Yeah. Well, that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I think. And not to take anything away from the paleo community, because I think the paleo community focuses, I think, a little bit more on nutrient density. I mean, if you look at kind of their focus is going to be on, obviously exercise, overall general health, where I feel like because keto is so successful at losing weight, that's the moniker it's become. It's okay, if you want to lose weight, do keto.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want to be like healthy and all around fit, and if you look at kind of the spokespersons for paleo, I mean, they're all jacked and ripped. Yeah, CrossFitters. So it makes sense. I think the benefit of being in the keto community is that you can do everything with paleo, but maybe even just fine tune it a little bit more to where you're still removing those carbohydrates that are causing some of the issues. I'm personally not an anti-carb person. You and I are going to have dinner later tonight. It's going to be, a fantastic dinner full of greens. So I think there's a place for carbohydrates, but here's the caveat. I think that you and I are metabolically, sound, right? So we never came to this needing to drop 200 pounds.
Right.
We don't have insulin resistance. We don't have diabetes. And so you and I will actually process carbohydrates extremely different than a lot of people who are trying to lose weight. And so that little nuance, I think, is something that's not focused on enough.
Yeah.
And especially now when you have like tribes where it's like carnivore is the only way to go, or keto is the only way to go, or whatever next, fad diet, we've become so segmented where the reality is that we're all kind of saying the same thing. Eat real food, get as high quality as you can, and then, fine tune it a little bit based on lab values and how you feel and markers. I think that's probably going to be your best way of optimizing specifically for yourself.
I totally agree 100%. And then other things like I'm sure we'll talk about later, heart rate variability, sleep tracking, all that. I think it's key. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have poked a little bit of fun at the carnivore diet, because I think it's just, again.
You're going to make some enemies.
I know, and I'm not trying to make enemies, but what I see is, and unfortunately I see this even with my own channel, is people will do what I say or do what the guru says. They watch one of Joe Rogan's podcasts, they do everything, And I just want people to think for themselves. That's it.
Yep.
Don't trust me. Do your own research, and what works for me or what works for you is going to be different, and what works for you is going to be different. So I just want people to try it on and see if it fits for them.
Absolutely.
Instead of just blindly following the guru because the guru said it worked for them. But it's like
Right.
you pick Sean Baker. He's very physically strong.
Yep.
The guy can take over 500 pounds on a hex bar and rep it for like 9 reps.
Yeah.
So if he eats 24 ounces of ribeye in one sitting,
Yep.
that's probably going to help to replenish his nitrogen turnover, muscle protein synthesis.
Right.
Sally Smith, who's 220 pounds, has never lifted a barbell in her life, eats 24 ounces of ribeye. Where is that going?
Yeah. So if you look at Sean Baker, and I love Sean, I got to interview him, and great guy. But he's 6'5", 250 pounds, right? And he's 50, but he's jacked. His testosterone is through the roof. So he could handle 4 to 6 pounds of meat a day. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, now your average person's like, oh, okay, sounds like a great idea. The question is, what happens with all that excess protein? Mm-hmm. I've got into a lot of debates with people who are, very pro carnivore. But if you look at most people who are really successful with it, they tend to have a higher lean body mass. So they're actually utilizing that protein a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I think it's great as far as like an elimination diet, where basically you're eliminating everything. Yeah. And so you're allowing your gut to heal, you're allowing, the gut lining to heal, and then maybe start incorporating, certain foods into your diet. I don't know, and I'll be the first to say I don't know, because there's no real long-term studies, obviously. I would say that anecdotally, I see tremendous success with people. But again, I think you have to put it into the context of where you're at in your life, what your goals are. Are you going to be doing the rowing machine and trying to break world records, or are you just trying to get healthy again?
Right.
And so take it into the context. And I think one of the greatest things about people like yourself, like Sean, who are trying to get the information out there is, take the information and then figure out, okay, does this apply to my life? Are the things that I want to tweak, and kind of take it from there. Yeah,
that's such a great point. Because Sally Smith, who's not active, maybe do carnivore, fine, but instead of 24 ounces of ribeye, maybe 8 ounces, and maybe a little bit of butter or whatever along with that. She's trying to burn the body fat.
Right.
So
can we talk about that?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you just brought that up, because there is this idea of endogenous versus exogenous fats, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's say you are trying to lose weight. That's your goal. So if you are consuming, and I see this a lot in the keto community, where we're tracking ketone values, like, they're the godsend of information, which I use ketones. I think they're very valuable. But I think you can chase ketones to your detriment, meaning that you can be in ketosis. I can get you in ketosis right now, and you'll never lose weight, because there still is this calorie expenditure equation where, it's not necessarily calories in equals calories out, but if you're consuming like 4,000 calories of, basically exogenous fat, and you're in ketosis because you're consuming most of those as MCT oils, you'll be in ketosis. Maybe you'll feel better, but you're not going to necessarily lose weight. And so I think a lot of people will get into kind of a keto world, and because there's so many good keto treats out there and ways to really kind of maximize fat intake, you can get into ketosis and still not lose weight. Yeah. And so,
It's for people, I think that's really challenging. I mean, if you don't kind of know the physiology a little bit, you're like, well, wait, I thought you're burning fat for fuel when you're in ketosis. So how can I not burn fat? So it's kind of, you want to break that down a little bit. We did a video about metabolic traffic. Okay. It was this idea of basically what you're alluding to when you're having fat bombs and MCT oil and coconut oil and butter. Okay, that's all great. It's low carb. Right. But the liver's going to, once the beta oxidation is kind of, has reached a point of saturation, it's going to kick up ketosis, right? And so if you're trying to beta oxidize, that is, basically oxidize fat from your body fat, and you have all this, as you alluded to, exogenous fat from your diet, there's going to be, one's got to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And preferentially. So your body, basically the way I tell people is your body doesn't care, right? So it's not going to sit there and judge you what you're consuming. Mm-hmm. All it cares about is what energy is coming in and what it's going to have to do with that energy. Yeah. And if you actually look at, really at a cellular level, the Krebs cycle, the end product of whether it's glucose absorption or beta oxidation of fatty acids is basically to allow for acetyl-CoA to go into the cycle and produce energy. And so whether it's coming from, predominantly glucose-based products or fat-based products, your body has to utilize those first, preferentially. And so once it's burned through them, if you still have an energy demand, meaning let's say you go out and you do a huge HIIT workout, okay, and you consume maybe 300 calories of fat, well, you probably are going to need more energy for your organ function, right?
Yeah.
And so at that point, then it'll switch over to using your endogenous fats, assuming that you're keto adapted. Because let's say you're basically based on a glucose-based diet, which most people are. So you're going to use whatever glucose you need, whatever you've consumed, and then you're going to hit a wall, right? You're going to bonk because you don't have any more glycogen stored to go through. And at that point, then you're going to either go out and drink or eat some more glucose, which is what I used to do as a,
a gel.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because you know that symptoms are coming on where you don't feel good. But if you're keto adapted, now you have access to this huge reservoir of fat, but you have to be able to actually access it. And if you're constantly consuming just fat all the time, then you're not going to actually access it. Right. And so you'll be in ketosis, yeah, because you're burning through your the fat intake that you're taking, and you'll get some ketosis from that, but you're not actually going to burn through your own fat stores.
Great point.
And I think that's something that nuance of, well, I'm in ketosis, but I'm not losing weight. Simple thing to do, decrease your fat intake, try to fast, So if you fast for a period of time, then you have really no energy coming in. And so you're going to start really firing up the enzymatic reactions that you need to actually burn through your own fat stores. And that's essentially the goal. I mean, that's what we want. Right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah, I mean, no one has a fat bomb deficiency. As much as I love them. And I will just say, my wife made a bunch of like really good fat bombs and stuff, and I crushed them like all in a day.
Oh, yeah. I personally cannot have them in the house.
Yeah.
Because, because just psychologically, I'll be like, oh, it's just a little bit. And I'll crush them. Like, I don't care if they're made with stevia, if they're made with, monk fruit, whatever the latest, greatest artificial sugar substitute. It still triggers an insulin response to me, and it still triggers that craving. And that, for me, I think psychologically, I have to make sure that I don't keep craving things.
Yeah. So that's why putting a label on a diet sometimes, because when you label a food as keto, and I do this all the time, and I made this huge mistake when gluten-free was coming on. I was like, oh, it's gluten-free, and I would just have a bunch of it because I was so focused on gluten is bad, it causes immune response, so if it's gluten-free, it must be healthy. So, and again, that's kind of why I poke fun at these different diets, because once we put the label on it, we just think, oh, meat's carnivore. I can have as much as I want.
Right.
And so that's the thing with fat bombs. And so again, going back, we're not trying to make fun of anyone, and I'm personally not, but context is everything.
Absolutely.
And that needs to be applied to all this stuff. So take this into consideration when we're talking about these things. But, fat bombs may help someone who's really transitioning. And maybe they have a little fatty liver, and their liver can't make these ketones that ours make. So yeah, maybe every 4 hours you need a little fat until they start to become more metabolically flexible.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because take it into the context of what you're trying to accomplish. I think, as you mentioned, transitioning over, sometimes if you're insulin resistant, you're going to have hepatic insulin resistance. It's going to be actually much harder to start converting some of those fat into ketone bodies. And so you might not get the satiety. You might not get the kind of brain kind of boost that you want, that people will talk about. And so, if it's like something that you allow for transition, that's fine. Just don't use it as a crutch going forward, And I think inevitably, most people who have stalled out on keto, it's because they're doing simple things like having 3 coffees with the MCT butter, or just, killing the fat bombs or something like that.
Yeah. Or not implementing fasting like you're talking about. I mean, when I first started, I was like, oh, this is easy. I just cut my carbs. So I could still have my 5 or 6 meals a day. They're just low carb meals. And I wasn't getting to the point where I was totally dropping insulin to enable this whole process. So that fasting was key, because I had this mindset, I can't fast, I'm going to lose muscle. Can't fast.
Yes, no, that's so not true, man. I mean, I'm not the most muscular guy, but I have functional muscle, and I fast usually about 23 hours a day, usually about 5 times a week.
Nice.
And I obviously, it's not to lose weight. It's just I find that it suppresses my insulin. Mental clarity is much better. I'm able to do a lot more throughout the day, and I don't feel sluggish. I think one of the issues for most people is that they've been told so many different things in terms of how they should eat, right? So it's have 3 big meals, or have 5 or 6, small meals throughout the day, so that you're always, meeting your energy demand. eat low fat, eat high fat. Like, I think a lot of it is just the confusion from, the medical community, and then also these different camps that are coming out saying, this is the end all be all way of eating. And so you kind of have to take it into the context of what's working for you. If it's working for you, keep doing it, right? Even if there's something even better out there, maybe, read about it, talk to people who are doing it, but really kind of fit it into what you think is going to work best for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. But along those lines, sometimes, I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Ramsey. He does financial advice.
Yeah.
So if someone were to call in, or we took a question live, which I would definitely want to get to, and someone said, hey, I'm struggling with the keto diet. What can I do? We would want to know, how long have they been overweight?
Yep.
What do their blood work look like? What's their body fat percentage? How much activity? How much life load, stress? All these things. Just like when someone calls Dave Ramsey and says, hey, I have 100,000 in debt.
Yeah.
What can I do? He says, what's family income?
Right.
How many credit cards?
Yeah.
You own a home.
Yeah.
All that. So it's like, people hear keto and they're like, oh, it didn't work for me. But it's like, well, what didn't work? Like,
Yes.
you need, like, what did you have going on beforehand? What'd you do? So again, just to underscore, like, if you call a financial planner, they're going to ask you all your background and figure out the money coming in, money going out, and we need to figure out the same thing for our bodies.
Absolutely.
And so I think, and again, it goes back to what I was saying. I want all of you to think for yourself. Don't just follow me. Don't just follow Dr. John or Ken Berry. All great people, absolutely, but try to figure out for yourself what's going to work.
Right.
And
one of the hardest things, I think, is to decipher all those variables, the complexity of human metabolism, into sound bites that people can walk away with. And that to me, I think, is one of the hardest things, because, as you mentioned, I mean, there's so many variables. Age, if you're male or female, what's your testosterone level? If you're a female, are you postmenopausal? Do you have insulin resistance? Do you have fatty liver disease? All those things are going to actually play into how well you adapt initially. I still have not found somebody who's done keto and not been successful because keto didn't work. It's usually something very simple as, they're using artificial sweeteners because they were told they're healthy, or they're using, keto products that are out there that are becoming very popular, or they're doing too much of the MCT oil, or something where there's just a little nuance. If you just change something up a little bit, all of a sudden they'll be successful. And then the other thing too is that, you have to take into consideration that for some people, it's been like 30 years. It's taken 30, 40 years to gain all this weight.
yes.
To think that you're going to radically drop weight within 30 days, and I get this question a lot, I need to lose 50 pounds in 30 days. Can you help me? No, I can't. Because for me, all that we're talking about is not a weight loss. Like, I rarely will use weight as my barometer.
Yeah.
It's really a lifestyle, and I call it a lifestyle because this is something that you want to implement for the rest of your life, where you're going to be healthy. And so whether it takes you a year or 18 months or 2 years to lose 200 pounds, that shouldn't be the focus. It should be, if I get healthy, if I get my cells healthy, then eventually I will lose the weight. And so I think if you just kind of switch your mindset to, I want to get healthy and I know that the weight will come off. And obviously you have to do kind of a leap of faith with that, right? Because you've been told so many different times that, if you do this, you'll lose weight, you'll be healthy. But if you kind of change your mindset where you want to get healthy and the weight will eventually come off, I think that leads to more success.
That's key. Yeah, and that's why friends of ours like Ken Berry and other people are saying, look at your blood sugar, track various things so that it's not just focused myopically on weight. Because if you look at, say, people that are very lean, bodybuilders, they're not necessarily healthy.
No.
Right? So there's not, yes, there is a correlation at some level, but it's not the, weight is not the only thing keeping you unhealthy.
Right.
And when you're free of it, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be healthy.
Right.
But yeah, that time-dependent phenomenon, that's something Jason Fung and I have talked a lot about, and he helped me really kind of understand that. And it makes sense, right? Going back to the David Ramsey thing, hey, David, I've been in debt for 30 years. Well, don't expect to be debt-free in 30 days, right? It's the same thing. And I like to use the analogy kind of metabolic debt.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have this kind of metabolic debt.
Yeah.
And they need to work through that. And that can take a long time.
Absolutely. And especially, when you look at, so I do a podcast with Jimmy Moore called the Keto Hacking MD podcast. And we're very different metabolically. And so we're trying to show that, what might work for me very easily will not work for him, and vice versa. because, the metabolic debt, I like that. I'm going to start using that.
Cool.
Hopefully you didn't trademark that, but
Yeah.
no, it's a good idea because you have to really allow your body to heal. And some things that we've done are unfortunately, you cannot reverse 100%. The human body is amazing in the sense that you can basically destroy about 90% of an organ. Not your brain, obviously, but like you can get rid of 90% of your liver and still function for all intents and purposes normally. You get rid of 1 more percent, you're in liver failure and you die. So same thing with kidneys.
Yeah.
So we have so much reserve that outwardly we might not actually know that there's some damage going on. And I think that's one of the issues with the labs that we check now for prediabetes and diabetes is we just check hemoglobin A1C, which you can have insulin resistance festering for 10, 15 years, and it'll never show up on a blood work. So you can check a hemoglobin A1C, it'll be normal, and your insulin will be 70. And so you have insulin resistance, you've been doing damage to the microvasculature, the small blood vessels that feed your brain, your heart, your kidneys, and not know it. And so the question then becomes, should we be checking different lab markers to get ahead of it? And the same thing with obesity versus skinny. So we used to think that obesity was the cause of a lot of these diseases. Now we think it's more of a symptom of this underlying dysfunctional metabolism, the insulin resistance. And obviously the fat cells start producing a lot of hormones that drive this. So it's kind of a positive loop, unfortunately. But if you look at people who come to the hospital who have heart attacks, 50% of them will be skinny. It's something called tofu, basically. You're thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And so you can't really use weight as your marker of health or unhealthy, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, that whole obesity paradox, right? Where, my brother-in-law is an interventional cardiologist, and sometimes he'll go in there to stent someone or look at and see what's going on. And it's a visibly overweight person. He thinks, it's going to be just occluded and clogged up. And he tells me, he's like, it was squeaky clean. Yet, again, I use Sally Smith a lot. Sally Smith, 130
Sorry, Sally.
pounds.
Hope you're not watching.
And her arteries were just a train wreck. And so that's a good point because, people do. I've seen some of the comments. I've had Jimmy on the podcast. Great friend, great guy. People are pretty rude to him. And it makes me sad because I really like him. And they're just judging one aspect of this really wonderful person. And yet, like you said, that may not be pathological. The fat is adaptive. That's why we're able to put on body fat still. And it's
there's a great book by Dr. Johnson out of Colorado called The Fat Switch. And in it, he talks about, why fructose and high fructose corn syrup are really what drive a lot of the fatty liver disease. But he also talked about evolutionary-wise how this was a normal component, right? So if you look at like bears, for instance, and I know we're not bears, but they actually get most of their fat for the winter from blueberries. So in the beginning of the kind of season, they're very tart. They don't actually put on much weight. But once they really ripen, bears will go crazy. They'll eat all the blueberries out there and they'll gain a ton of weight. Well, you can make the analogy that we're basically doing the same thing, except we don't actually turn that switch off. And so, now with globalization where, you can get blueberries or strawberries or whatever you want 24/7, well, then we have access to it versus before. Like now, our kids went out and they picked berries off the bushes, right?
Yeah, it was awesome.
And so they enjoyed it. There's nothing wrong with children who are, not insulin resistant having berries off the bushes. But then they won't do that 24/7. They won't do that every day of the year. They'll do it when it's seasonal. So for us as humans, we have to be able to turn that switch off. And I think that's one of the benefits of keto is that you're able to turn that switch off, and that switch being basically insulin, right? And so you just have to think about it in terms of evolutionary wise, what were we supposed to do? How do we adapt to survive? And now, what is that doing to us to actually cause us to be unhealthy and really not survive? I mean, our lifespan as humans is going down, and that's pretty scary.
Totally scary.
Yeah,
like we were talking about the schools and the kids these days and how much sugar, and you were involved with that and everything. So along those lines, I mean, some people will say, why are you always making such a big stink about keto and everything? And I get excited about kind of the epigenetic effects of beta-hydroxybutyrate. But I think just on a big picture, and I was with Ted Naiman, there was the showing of the magic pill.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So it's a good one. And so afterwards, they asked us to come up and talk. And someone asked a great question. Well, does everyone have to be keto, or should they be keto? And my response, and I would love to hear your perspective, is I think it's a great buffer to increase resiliency metabolically in this 21st century environment where we're constantly exposed to food 24/7.
Right.
We have the mangoes on Christmas Eve from wherever else in the world.
Chile or something.
Yeah. So it's like having that mindset will help people navigate through this society that is very kind of unnatural.
Right.
What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because I would say, so the way I approach it is yes and no. So if you have a metabolic disease like seizure, epilepsy, cancer, insulin resistance, I think you should be pretty hardcore keto, in ketosis, checking levels, because your metabolism is going to be very different from somebody who's healthy to begin with. I do think that it's a slippery slope once you start incorporating a little bit of grains, a little bit of carbohydrates, a little bit of, fast food. It's a very slippery slope in terms of you can get out of ketosis, you can get out of really kind of focusing on the quality of your food. I personally have been keto for, 14, 15 years. I've lost track, and I really haven't jumped out of it for an extended period of time, specifically because of what you just mentioned. I feel much better. My brain is sharper. I know from a metabolic standpoint that I'm not harming my body. I kind of have a unique perspective in the sense that I used to work as a hospitalist, and I worked in the South. And so after residency, I figured I'm going to go change the healthcare system, and I'm going to go to the worst place in the country to do it in terms of health outcomes. And I was scarred, I think, from that experience in the sense that I would see people our age or younger, 20s, 30s, who are on dialysis, who have heart failure with EFs of 10%, basically end stage, who have, diabetes that's through the roof, amputations, strokes. So really, I think for me, that freaks me out. Getting older in life, seeing a lot of people who have vascular dementia or basically type 3 dementia, basically, caused by insulin and glucose, really scares me. I want to be sharp. I want to be there for my children, my grandchildren. I want to be a functional part of society. So for me, I really feel like being in ketosis is something that allows me to maintain my metabolic state. Some people I think can do okay with more of a just paleo type of way of eating, if they're doing a little bit of intermittent fasting with it, and I think, so there are ways to maybe variation on the keto itself, but I think it's a good base for probably 95% of the population.
Yeah, I would agree. I think maybe some of the athletes out there, strength and conditioning folks, a lot of people are doing high-end athletics, if they can do more carbs while keeping their biomarkers in check, right? And if you're a bigger person, Sean Baker, Ken Berry, you're 6'6", whatever, and you do meat, that's fine, totally fine on that.
Yeah, sorry. But if you think about it, I mean, the carnivore is essentially keto in terms of ratios of fat to protein. Ted and I had this kind of discussion back and forth about the role of protein in terms of satiety, but also as the major kind of macronutrient for nutrition. And I love Ted, and he's got a very convincing argument. And so I think, incorporating protein is important. Is it to the degree where these guys are eating 300 to 400 grams of protein? Again, it depends on the situation. If you're throwing up 500-pound, sessions, sure, you could probably handle that amount of protein. But everybody else, something has to happen to that protein. You have to actually either, burn it as energy or convert it into something. And so for people who are not as metabolically sound, it might be an issue.
This is such a great point. Yeah, I mean, that was my question. So it's like, why go carnivore if eventually some of that protein will be back converted potentially to lipids or other things, right? So it's like, why not just have a more balanced diet with low in carbs, high in good fats, high in good protein? Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I understand the argument that plants have anti-nutrients and this and that, but I was kind of wrapping my mind around it. Then there's the flip side where some people say, well, if you have vegetables, they're unabsorbed anyway, they just contribute to stool density. So why have those? So I kind of see there's kind of two yin and yang going on a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I like the variety of foods.
Yeah.
So I like, we're going to have some, wild caught salmon tonight. I like the benefit of that. I like the taste of it. I like avocados. Maybe it's just a selfish thing where I don't want to give up those other things. I've tried carnivore. I don't have any problems with it. I just can't see myself for 50 years just eating meat.
Right.
Personally.
Did your glucose rise at all?
It did, yeah. So when I did the experiment, granted, it was only for 7 days. Please don't yell at me. It wasn't, randomized control trial, but glucose, my normal glucose ranges are in the 60s to 70s. And mine was in the 90s, 100s. So it definitely spiked more than I was comfortable with. And more to that point was I didn't feel as good. So I really didn't.
Mental clarity and some of that just was not
Ketones started dropping. Mental clarity wasn't there. And I was trying to really focus on, quality sources of meat.
Yeah.
So there wasn't that kind of confounding variable. So
interesting.
The flip side is people will say, well, you didn't give it enough time. You didn't get adapted. I'm not really sure what that adaptation is supposed to be. Like biochemically, you're not creating new enzymes.
Mitochondria wouldn't really,
So I don't really know what that argument. Maybe absorption would be a little bit better. I just personally, I didn't have a good experience.
Yeah. And think about that delta between your normal glucose is around 60 versus 90 or 100. Multiply 365 times whatever, 30, 40 more years. All the glycation, oxidation. I mean, that to me, and that's why I'm excited, just like you, with the keto diet, is because you're driving down that glucose, that insulin.
Right.
So it may not affect you day to day, from here to next week, but more energy and all that. But I'm talking from a longevity perspective.
Absolutely.
That's exciting.
Yeah, and then there's the question of the preparation of the meat. I mean, I guess you could say that with any type of animal product, but how are you preparing it? Are you going to get the charred kind of appearance to it, which is actually going to be more of a carcinogen? Are you going to influence autophagy mTOR with the amount of protein that you're consuming? Sean will say, well, if I live to 94 instead of 96, but I'm a badass, I don't care about mTOR. Yeah, okay, but I mean, I've seen, cancer wards, and I personally don't want to stoke that fire. And so, and the point really of this is, a lot of this is, we are on the forefront of science at this point, where we don't have a ton of stuff to back us up. In terms of randomized control trials, we are not drug companies. We don't have billions of dollars to throw at studies. So a lot of this is, N=1 experimentations, or for me with my clients, really tracking data and saying, okay, well, if you do this, this is what happens to you personally. So maybe you want to kind of change it up a little bit. So again, it goes back to, I have no problems with people trying carnivore. If they're having great experiences from it, great. But maybe track some data just to make sure that you're not stoking some of that fire that we talked about.
Exactly. That was my question. I wanted to ask Ken this. Because he's out there in a good way. Like, I love his personality. Like, he pokes fun. What do you call it? Spiderweb MD. He says some awesome things, right?
Man.
But I wanted to ask him, I'm like, so what if the medical board, and Sean Baker's an MD, you're an MD as well. So if you prescribe a carnivorous diet to someone, and another in an internal medicine doc or a specialist says, hey, this Dr. John, he's out here prescribing these meat-only diets, how would that play out?
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
I mean, so I love Ken. I think I've told Ken to tone it down a little bit because, so as a medical professional, you are kind of set by guidelines in terms of what you recommend.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people will say, well, my doctor won't prescribe this. They don't agree with this. Sometimes it might not actually be the doctor actually thinking that. It might just be that you have to go by guidelines. So let's take a scenario where I, as a physician, recommend a keto diet for people, and they have the best lab markers, they have the best outcomes, and yet down the road they have a stroke. Could be for something completely different, not related to their diet. They smoke 10 packs of cigarettes a day, whatever it is. They can come back and sue you for liability, and you'll lose because you're not practicing the guidelines. Now, flip scenario where you're practicing 100% the guidelines and recommending a grain-based, high-carb, healthy grain diet, and they have a heart attack because of the diet. Let's say they don't smoke, they exercise, they do meditation, they do everything that they're supposed to do, but they have a heart attack. Because you're practicing within the guidelines, you will be cleared, most likely.
crazy paradox.
And so that's why I think you don't see many doctors out there talking about it, because that's a huge concern. I mean, we unfortunately in America are in a litigious society, right? We sue for everything. I mean, you see lawsuits because you slipped on the floor. I mean, like we don't take responsibility for our own kind of health or situations. I think one of the things that's really great about what Nina Teicholz is doing is pushing the guidelines to change. And so I think in order for us to change as a society and really kind of make a movement, it's going to take multiple kind of focuses. So, Nina really kind of focusing on the guideline changes, which will affect hospitals, that'll affect schools, what they're allowed to feed children. And in the hospital is a great kind of vertical. You and I kind of promoting to the masses our experience, what the research shows, how to actually do this, so you get kind of a grassroots groundswell. And then that pushes the medical establishment to also readdress kind of these inconsistencies with what the guidelines are recommending, is another really great kind of way to change the paradigm in terms of what we're recommended. But until that happens, and you're starting to see it a little bit with the American Heart Association dropping the amount of sugar they recommend, which is a big step. Until it really happens where the guidelines have completely changed, where saturated fat is not the devil, healthy grains should not be there, and we're promoting more of a healthy fat, protein, and some carbohydrate diet. I don't think you're going to see a lot of doctors go out there, and definitely you're not going to see many Ken Berries out there.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Well, I don't think anyone can replicate his personality.
No,
he is a crack up. I love talking with him. Yeah. Well, along those lines, though, that's part of the reason why, to be honest, I started interviewing a lot of medical professionals about keto, because for 11 years I was a supplement sales rep. And I would sell professional only line supplements, Zymogen, to doctors and so forth. And a lot of doctors that I would run into would say, I wouldn't recommend a keto diet. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? Like, you don't know this research. So I was trying to convince, these were customers of mine at the time. And that's how I, John Rowe and other people, David Perlmutter, how I kind of started on the keto train with Jimmy Moore and others.
Right.
So anyway, it's kind of interesting that I didn't realize back then, I just thought they didn't know the science that I knew. So I was like, we'll convince more people with the science, but it's also that standard of care, the guidelines that they're kind of entrenched in and they have to follow to an extent.
Yep.
But if you're like if you're an insurance-free provider, like, do you take insurance?
No.
Okay. So you're just cash only. Is there some sort of if you prescribe different diets to different people, is there a way to kind of circumvent that as a practitioner, or?
Well, you have like a contract that basically states, this is what the research shows. So what I do personally is I have a Google Drive, basically, where it has Dropboxes of every major research study out there on keto, on low carb, on all the different biohacks that I recommend. And so if anybody's interested, they have access to that, and they can look at the research themselves.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think the best support is the research. So obviously there's variations in terms of the type of studies that they are, but still the research, I think, is supportive enough at this point where we can pretty much convincingly say, look, keto is healthy because of this.
Yeah.
Is there still a liability perspective? Yes, but then there's also the ethical question of, as a physician, our goal is, our first oath that we take is to do no harm. And so if I know personally that I'm telling somebody that they should eat a certain diet, and I see that their glucose levels are going through the roof, I see their insulin levels going through the roof, I see that they're unhealthy, they're gaining weight, is that really ethically something I should be doing?
Right.
And so that was really one of the biggest battles that I had internally was, should I take the leap of faith and say, look, I'll be supported by the results of people I'm helping? And for me, I think it was an ethical question where, I would rather be doing something as a physician where I feel like I'm helping people, despite the risk that, there might be some, lawsuit.
Pushback.
I'll call you.
We know most people, though, that are attracted to this space are not going to be the litigious type anyway. They seek you out. Right. They've learned from you, and they're like, wow, I want to see him as my doctor because my doctor doesn't do this sort of stuff, which is great. But there is random crazy people out there in the world, unfortunately. So
it usually happens to be like a patient who has another family member who's a physician who hears like, well, they're doing keto and kind of warns them and that usually is how it becomes kind of an issue to talk about.
I see.
Yeah.
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 Is there like a territorial thing with doctors? Like when you do something a little bit different, their feathers get a little fluttered?
Sometimes.
Okay. Interesting stuff.
Next topic.
Yeah. Let's get into top, and we'll take some questions
Sure.
here in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
But like we talked a lot about diet, and I love this conversation. We could probably go on for hours. But
Yeah.
top biohacks. So,
Yes.
we talked about like food quality, nutrient density,
Yep.
context. Remember, your goals, your metabolic debt. If someone is listening and they're like, okay, I think I've mastered keto, but what's next? What are some of the
Yeah.
top things they should do?
Yeah, no, great question. So just a little kind of backstory. So we were on a cruise together, and I had kind of heard of your stuff online. I had seen some posts, but I never really kind of listened too much in depth. And then I was sitting at your talk with your wife, Deanna, and I was kind of closing my eyes, and all of a sudden you started talking, and every single thing that you said, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, that's right. And I'd never actually heard a talk specifically on biohacking and keto associated with it, which was spot on. So I was like, okay, I got to talk to this guy. He knows what he's talking about. And so some of the things that you talked about, which I think are really on my forefront. So start off with sleep, right? So again, if you're going to do biohacks, two things. Number one, if you're not dialed in on your nutrition, whatever it is, biohacks are probably not going to add much value, right? Number two, there's a range of biohacking that's becoming very popular where there's some where you have to be a multimillionaire to do it.
Yeah.
And so that to me is cool. And I love testing these products, but is that really applicable to like the majority of people? No. So I try to focus on the ones that, number one, are not going to cost you a ton of money. Number two, are easy to do. And number three, that you can actually have the time in your day to actually do these things, right? And so what I try to do is I try to stack them where I do a whole bunch within a short period of time. So, but sleep for me, I think is probably the most important for a number of reasons. But number one, there is this cycle where if you don't sleep well, the next day your cortisol level is very high. So your main stress hormone is very high. So the next day your insulin is going to be higher. You're going to be hungrier, and you're going to preferentially want carbohydrates. And it's just the way the brain works. Yeah. So what happens, let's say you have a bad night of sleep, is that the next day, you're off, you're not sharp mentally, you're hungrier, so you start eating probably worse foods. And then that cortisol boost actually lasts for about 48 hours. So it doesn't go down right away. And so you're really fighting that battle. And people who work like night shifts can tell you, they're going to be much hungrier, they're going to have a harder time losing weight. Because there's a lot of research that looks at really kind of the circadian rhythm of our organs. And Dr. Panda at the Salk Institute's really looking into this, which I think is fascinating, is that let's say you eat late at night, even if it's keto, you're actually going to be suppressing melatonin production from your pancreas, which I think is fascinating. Wow. And so you're not going to sleep as well that night. And so then the next day you're going to have higher cortisol levels, so you're not going to be able to control your appetite as well. So if you really dial in your sleep, that to me is, I think, one of the most important things. And you and I track it through the Oura Ring, which I think is a really valuable tool to do that. So that would be a big one. Exercise is a huge one. I know you're a big proponent of it in the sense that we talked earlier about, energy needs, right? So you have to actually be able to do something with the energy you're consuming. Obviously, we have a BMR, your basic metabolic rate of what you need just for your organs to function. But then once you go beyond that, adding in a HIIT workout, or it doesn't have to be a 3-hour run. It can just be a really high intensity 30-minute session where you're actually, mobilizing the glycogen stores that you have. You're building muscle mass, which increases your BMR, goes a long way towards really kind of utilizing the energy that you're consuming. If you're fat adapted, you preferentially will use fatty acids as your energy source. So Finney and Bullock did the study where they took, endurance athletes and put them, in a cohort of glucose dominant and fat dominant. And they found that the fat dominant guys were using about 89% of their energy from fat, which is awesome. Yeah. So if you add that in, now all of a sudden you're really kind of boosting your ability to use your fat stores. We talked about fasting. So fasting, in my experience, has been one of the most beneficial things you can do as well, because your body is really smart in terms of conserving energy. And so if you are not fasted and you're basically just using glucose as your predominant fuel source, you will not make the enzymes needed to do the beta oxidation. So, because you don't need them, your body's not going to make them, right?
Yeah.
But when you start fasting, you allow the gene expression to happen. So you start making those enzymes. So then you're going to be able to really start breaking down your fat stores much more efficiently. So those are a couple of ones. I would say sauna is probably my favorite one. I know you do this. I personally like the infrared sauna, but again, that'll do a number of things. It's going to lower your cortisol. It's going to actually boost your energy expenditure. It's going to allow for relaxation time. And then it's going to increase the density and the amount of mitochondria that you have. So again, if you think about mitochondria really as kind of your battery of your body, you want to have the most efficient ones, and you want to have as many as possible.
Yeah.
So you just are burning energy all the time. And then my favorite, which I've gotten people on, is the cold thermogenesis, with the cold bath. And I think you had a video where I think you jumped in and then Deanna jumped in. And it was pretty funny to watch.
Yeah, it took her a little while. I'm like, just do it. But I've been doing the cold shower, so that's just another resiliency thing.
Right.
But yeah, when I first heard of that, and I think was I telling you this hiking? I can't remember if I was telling you this or Ben on Sunday. But when I first heard of like cold thermogenesis and cold showers from a naturopathic doctor in 2011, I tried it. Yeah. I was out of the shower.
Oh, you
like
told
that.
me this. Yeah.
And then now that I'm keto, it's like everything I'm more resilient. And I'm not trying to say it's magical. Everyone needs to be keto, but this has just been my experience. I'm much more resilient to cold, much more resilient to heat, to fasted, to going without food. So to me, it's like, how could that be bad for me?
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. And it's probably the hardest one for people to jump on board with, but once they do it, I mean, they're converted. Because, so again, everything that you were talking about, from being keto to all the biohacks that we just described, at the end of the day, we're suppressing insulin, which is great, but we're also increasing our body's ability to generate and burn energy by increasing your mitochondria, by really kind of reducing systemic inflammation. So you feel better, but you're also generating more energy. And so when you do the cold thermogenesis, the showers don't count. And they're actually the most painful thing in my experience, but you are really like a fat burning machine. And for me, as I'm getting older, joint pain goes away. I feel more energetic. I just feel better. And I sleep much better.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have a little anecdote on that. So since we talked on the cruise, you were telling me that like one of the things that you've done. See, I always thought the cold thermogenesis was a little stimulatory. So I was afraid to kind of do this at night.
Right.
And you were saying, I've had some of my deepest, this Dr. John told me, some of my deepest sleep scores doing cold thermogenesis at night. And I was like, okay, well, I'll experiment with that. And man, my sleep scores I've doubled my deep sleep.
Have you really?
Yeah.
Yeah. No doubt.
And so, because I think it has to do with your body temperature during sleeping. And so this door right here sorry folks, you can't see, I installed one of these in our bedroom too, because we had like another like French door, and it was just weird to keep it open at night. Right. So now we can just pull the slider, leave it open. So when I hit the bed, it's really cool in there. It's like a good, 55 something degrees.
Nice. Yeah.
And I think the cold thermogenesis before night just helps you stay cold going to sleep.
It does. Yeah.
Is that
So
part of it?
yeah, so absolutely. So dropping your core temperature, and again, people freak out like they're going to get hypothermic and die. It's really hard to become hypothermic unless you're like Wim Hof and, spending 2 hours in the ice bath. We're talking, I do it for about 30 minutes and I've tested my core temperature. There's a way to do it. I probably shouldn't say it online, but it involves, a thermos. But basically, you'll drop your core temperature about 1 degree. But just that ability to drop your core temperature profoundly affects deep sleep. I'll notice it'll double.
Wow.
At certain times.
And you feel so much better.
Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing what sleep can do. So yeah, these biohacks. When the biohack thing came on, and there's all these Instagram people, biohacking Paul and this, and they had, infrared lights up their nose, and it was like, seriously,
come on,
guys, what are we doing? But I've been a huge believer, and now light therapy. I have the Juve light, and this is one of these things I at first thought, oh my gosh, another gimmick, but that doubled my testosterone, doubled. Yeah. I was like, all right, this stuff is so legit. I'm glad you're.
Yeah. So funny enough, we're traveling right now with my family. So you saw my car; it's pretty packed. Yeah. I brought the Juve light with me.
Oh my god! Do you have the one that's on the door? Oh my gosh!
So
love it.
Pretty hardcore with that, but no, it makes a difference, especially like we're in Seattle area, especially in the wintertime where you're not going to be able to get that light exposure that you need produce vitamin D to increase your growth hormone. All these hormones are really affected, and you see that in seasonal depression. And so doing something as simple as, photobiomodulation, again, you're going to increase the amount of mitochondria that you're producing. You're going to burn more energy. You're going to decrease inflammation. So it's really, I tell people, you want to get out of this negative cycle that most of us are in, where, we don't eat well, so we don't sleep well. We're on our electronics all day because we want to be kind of distracted from our day-to-day life. And once you kind of are able to get out of that rut and start focusing on simple things, which I think starts with nutrition, and then you start incorporating all these different biohacks to really kind of get into a positive cycle where you feel healthier, so you want to be outdoors, so you want to get light exposure, you want to get better sleep, you want to do all these things. And then it's just, once people realize how bad they used to feel versus how good they feel now, I think that sells itself. People are buy in, just because a lot of us, I think, don't remember what it feels like to feel good. You just feel like crap all the time. So you drink some coffee or some Red Bull to try to get up in the morning. Now, when I wake up, I'm like jumping out of bed.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go.
Exactly. Yeah. And then just one day of inactivity or poor sleep or sleeping with the Wi-Fi on, it throws you off to the point where, because people do make fun of you, like, oh, come on, you don't put your cell phone in your pocket. What's wrong with that?
Right.
And you don't realize like how in tune you are with your health once you start to climb up and you notice such small little differences.
Yeah, I get a lot of weird looks once in a while.
Yeah. And you wearing the underwear that are EMF guarding?
Yeah. So there's a company called Faraday's, and they make underwear where basically it has like a guarding for EMF. And EMF, I don't know if a lot of people know about it, but basically it's, a very low signal that has been told to us that it's safe. But there's a lot of research that looks at whether or not this really stimulates parts of your cells that produce like a massive influx of calcium, which really kind of stimulates the cells. Specifically in testosterone and sperm cell production for men, most of us keep it in our front pocket, right next to our goods, right? And so you're basically heating up your testes the whole day. And so then you wonder, well, sperm counts have gone down by 50%, fertility rates are going down, people are needing IMF treatments. Is that some of that related to the EMF production from the phone? I personally don't want to have more kids. I have 3 kids, but I'm concerned about testosterone production. I want to make sure that that's not an issue. And so, hey, if I have to wear some fancy underwear that blocks
awesome.
it, they feel great, I mean, why not?
I think it's great. Yeah, I remember a friend of mine, Amir Rosic, was coming out with them too. This was like, I think 3 or 4 years ago.
Yep.
And this other, I don't know what the brand was or if it ever took off, but it was one of those things I first saw it. I'm like, really? And then now I'm like, well, your phone is always around. Yeah. And if you feel funny here, Dr. John, there's a big cell phone tower about, I think, 1/10 of a mile away.
Nice.
Yeah, I just, it's, so anyway, I mean, look, we do what we can with the tools we have.
Yeah. And that's a really important point because, in the ideal world, you become a hermit living in the middle of Canada. Sorry, Canadians, but there's a lot of wilderness out there with no access to any technology or anybody. Yeah, sure, but that's not realistic, right? Yeah. So a lot of it, of what you and I are discussing is, how do you take the knowledge that we have and fit it into the environment that you live in and still be like semi-normal, where you can, interact with people and you don't walk around with like, a silver suit all day because you don't want to have access to like any Wi-Fi signals. But you can do simple things like turn your phone off at night, do a kill switch on your Wi-Fi. Like, nobody's on their Wi-Fi. I mean, I guess some people are, but if you go to bed at 10 and you wake up at 6, turn it off for those 8 hours, and there's no harm in that. And you might notice that your sleep patterns might be better.
Yeah. I mean, until you, I've actually gotten some flack for talking about Wi-Fi and EMF on people on YouTube. So until you track these biomarkers, you don't really know if it's affecting you. And there is ample research about that. But to kind of come back full circle, the importance of biohacking, I want to talk about your book and your course in just a minute. But these are all mitochondrial-based therapies at some level. Right. And if we think about what's so exciting about the ketogenic diet, it's really like a mitochondrial-based diet in a sense. Yeah. Right? And so we're just reinforcing the dietary, like the switches and the molecular mechanisms that make the diet so effective and from a health standpoint are being reinforced by the cold stress, by the sauna, by the exercise, by the fasting, by the good sleep. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you look at kind of how energy burns in our mitochondria, So if you burn glucose, you're going to make a lot more of ROS, reactive oxygen species. And so obviously you need these things. These are what we use to kill bacteria, viruses that come into our system. But if that's all you're burning, you're producing excess of these, right? And so a lot of people will say, well, take some antioxidants and buffer it. Well, yeah, you could do that, but you could also say, well, why don't you switch over to more of a cleaner fuel, right? I kind of compare it to like clean diesel versus gasoline, right? So keto, you're really burning fat. Fat produces a lot more energy, produces less ROS. So at a cellular level, their cells are much healthier. They can deal with these kind of ROS that are being produced. And then once you start incorporating all these other biohacks, number one, from a hormonal perspective, you're increasing testosterone, you're increasing growth hormone, you're increasing vitamin D, which is really tied to a lot of things in terms of osteoporosis, but also cardiovascular disease. And then you're also really kind of improving overall brain health. So it's really kind of a symbiotic relationship. And that's why I feel like they fit very well within each other. Obviously, you can go off the deep end and get like a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. If you're a millionaire, that's great. There's a lot of benefit from that. You can get a lot of these kind of new advanced stem cell injections and stuff like that. But most people can't do that. And I don't think most people want to do that. Yeah. I think you can do simple things. And to be honest with you, I know it seems like what we're talking about is really like avant-garde. This is all ancestrally what people just did, right? So what I love about a lot of things that you and I are talking about is that if you go to Finland or Sweden or any of the Nordic countries, they just did this stuff. Yeah. They didn't know the biochemistry of why it worked, but they knew it made them feel better and live longer, right? And so I think everything that you and I are talking about is really rooted in our ancestral history. We're just bringing it back to the forefront because now we have the science to really back it up. We have the technology to measure the impact on our bodies, right, through HRV and sleep tracking and lab values. And so it's really like the optimal time to really kind of try it out on yourself because you can see, well, okay, this works for me, this doesn't work for me, and then make changes.
Totally. Well, and we see our population is so much less resilient.
Yeah.
I mean, you go on a Southwest airline flight and I see people in their 50s or they have a wheelchair, the cane.
Yep.
And you go to Ireland, you see people in their 90s jumping into the ocean, in the freezing ocean.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So all these strategies, the diet, the fasting, exercise, they increase your resilience, which improves quality of life.
Yep.
And you don't need $1 million to do any of this stuff. I mean, most gyms, when I travel, I go to 24-hour fitness or Good Life Fitness or whatever, and they have a sauna in there.
Yep.
And I often see people, Koreans and Russians in the
Yes.
sauna because it's part of their culture. They like it hot. Even on the cruise. I don't know. Did I tell you this?
No.
There was this Russian gentleman in the. We went on the low carb cruise. Jimmy Moore's great people. Ken Berry's the speakers. Awesome speakers out there. And you're going. We'll talk about the next one coming up in just a minute. But there was a Russian gentleman in there, and it was hot as heck. He had towels blocking all the
sensors.
Yeah, and he had water going.
Yeah.
No, so the door had like a little gap there, and so he's blocking that.
Yep.
And he liked it really hot. So we started talking about the culture. He's like, every Sunday, this is what you do in Russia. Yeah. And anyway, so there's a low carb cruise coming up. It goes in the...
Yeah, so there's going to be the Keto 101 cruise. It's like third week of September.
Nice.
Myself, Ken Berry, Maria Emmerich, Jimmy Moore, and his wife, Christine, and Nisha Berry are going to be there.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah, it should be a good one. I think it's going to be a little bit more intimate, in-depth, kind of really going through the nuances, some of what we've talked about, looking at keto, not so much from like a weight loss perspective, but like how it works at a cellular level, right? And I think if people can understand really at that depth, then it makes sense.
It becomes more intuitive. And then and then you can tinker and test and feel comfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome. And so you and Ken worked on a course.
Yeah.
I have the link right below here, guys. So let's talk about that. I think it's... what's the title?
Yeah, so it's Keto 101. It's at Biohack MD, and basically, Ken and I get a lot of questions. I mean, we probably get 20, 30 emails a day with the same questions. And so, he and I were talking about, there's a lot of information. I mean, in a way, now that keto is becoming so popular, there's so much information. Yeah. And I think it's almost too much information for a lot of people who don't know like the good sources to go to. Mm-hmm. So if people ask me like, okay, what are the sources that you would recommend? I would say, obviously you, Ken Berry, Maria Emmerich, there's certain Jimmy Moore. I would say there's certain ones that I would really go to, but I haven't really found a detailed course where it goes into the basic, all you need to know about being in ketosis from a cellular level, like why it works, from an enzyme reaction standpoint, why it suppresses your insulin. So it's really trying to be as detailed as possible so that once you go through it, you know everything you need to know to be successful.
Awesome.
Basically.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people and repetition, and you're going to hear it from different people and learn different, how it resonate with how people say it and all that. We all have different things we gravitate towards.
Absolutely.
So that's awesome. So guys, the link is right below that. And if you're listening in iTunes, I'll put it at the show notes as well.
Yeah.
What else you got? You got a book coming out.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Busy times.
Yeah, I got tons of stuff.
Yeah. So as part of the podcast that I'm doing with Jimmy Moore, we are basically what we're doing is we're testing all these different kind of components. So we started off with, all the macronutrients, protein, fat. We didn't do carbohydrates just because we know what it's going to do to us. And then we're going into all the different biohacks, some of which we've talked about. And so at the time that we're recording this, I'm putting Jimmy through like a gauntlet of biohacks specifically because as you mentioned before, the rap on Jimmy is that he's been doing this for so long and yet he still has weight to lose. And so he's either cheating, which I think most people think. And I've been around the guy for long enough that I can tell you he's not cheating.
Right.
And so then the question becomes, well, why is it so hard for him to lose weight? And a lot of it has to do with not incorporating all these different modalities that you and I talked about, because again, I think nutrition is a big component, probably 70%, and that's just like a rough estimate. But he has high stress levels as measured by some of the lab markers, so I have him tracking sleep data, which he's always done, doing HIIT, doing cold thermogenesis, doing sauna, fasting, and then we're going to incorporate some more things. So basically the book is going to be each chapter focused on keto as like the basis of health, and then how to start incorporating some of the things that you and I talked about. What's the research behind it? Why is it symbiotic with being in ketosis? And then how can you actually track some data to say, okay, this is working for me?
Totally.
So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I think I see him on Instagram flipping tires and then the cold stuff. But I mean, it's great because he's exposing a lot of people that have maybe mastered the diet because he's cranked out a lot of books over the years. And then now people are like, oh yeah, well this is next. And maybe I don't need to fine tune and start tracking macros. Maybe there's other non-dietary related stuff. So that's really cool. Let's see what else. Yeah, I could see the stress because he pumps out a lot of content. A lot of podcasts, a lot of books. So you can tell he's a very driven guy. Very driven. Which is great. I mean, he's able to produce a lot of stuff, but that also can, affect sleep and prioritizing rest and recovery. Maybe that's part of.
Absolutely. No, I think specifically for him, and what I think is really great is it's relatable to a lot of people as well, right? And so a lot of people who might, either stall or not be having as much success, but they're really kind of dialed into their keto kind of diet, maybe they need to start thinking about these other things. And I personally will say, based on my experience, that most of the time it's something that's not being addressed. So whether it's being on, iPhones or tablets late at night, so they're not getting good sleep, so that the next day, like you're making it much harder for yourself by doing all those things. And so you can do some simple tweaks and really kind of optimize your health and the weight comes off. And so,
that's a great perspective. A couple final personal questions here. Who inspires you the most right now? Like a friend, or do you look up and maybe a Tony Robbins or who what books inspire you?
So I'll start off by saying my wife and kids. Nice. So I know that's probably cheesy, but part of being a parent, as you know, is I think really being able to pass down like knowledge to your children. And so one of the things that I've noticed, especially with my oldest son, who's 8, is he used to like just get annoyed that we would talk about this stuff all the time. And now he's realizing, because some of his friends are getting kind of obese or sick all the time, and noticing that, wow, okay, this stuff makes sense. I see now what you're talking about. And so just to see that click in his brain, whether when he's 18 he goes out and goes crazy, I don't know. But at least I'll be able to give them a base of knowledge for 18 years where they know like this is real.
Totally.
My wife, just because she does everything that I do, she buys in, but she's inquisitive. She keeps asking, for the science behind it, and she realizes the benefits. And then in terms of like just people out there that, anytime I look at your stuff, I know we're on camera together, so this is not about, me tooting your horn, but I think one of the knocks on the keto community is that unlike the paleo community, there's not that many people who look the part. And I hear that a lot. Like, well, I'll do keto, but who am I going to be inspired by, right? And so I think there's the one aspect where you're able to give the information out, but then there's the other aspect where you actually are living the part. And so, not just looking the part, but actually this is your life. This is what you do. And so I'm always looking at your stuff and to see, okay, what's Mike up to next? Because, it's probably going to be beneficial to try it. And then, in terms of just kind of luminaries, I think things like what Dr. Perlmutter's is doing is amazing. People like Nina Teicholz, Dr. Asim, people who are putting themselves out there and being exposed and getting a lot of pushback. And yet they're really kind of driven saying, look, we need to make a change. I don't care what it costs me, professionally, financially. Guys like Tim Noakes, even guys like Dr. Westman, who I've had a chance to really converse with, who are really saying enough is enough. We need to make a change.
Yeah.
And so seeing those people really kind of push the envelope kind of inspires me to do the same.
Totally. Yeah, I think we're at this pivot where if we don't, as a society, make massive changes, it can be slowly just eroding. If we think about the military enrollments in the military, the percentage of GDP allocated towards healthcare expenditures, there's all these things, the children in school and ADHD, and you were telling me on Sunday the rate of autism is
So the rate of autism right now is 1 in 8 children. In the next 2 generations, it's going to be 1 in 4.
Wow.
And so you see like these isolated trends starting to happen, and you wonder like, why isn't there a connection being made where it's like, okay, is this normal? No, it's not normal. What is changing? Is it our ability to recognize it? No, not really, because we've known what the signs and symptoms are for a while. So there must be something environmentally, whether it's EMF or dietary or just kind of environmental toxins, that's really driving this issue. 50% of all the dollars spent by Medicare are spent on diabetes and diabetes-related issues. 50%. So we talk about universal health care as a right, and I believe that it should be a right for people. But it doesn't matter if it's Obamacare, if it's Trump care, or some other kind of form of health care. Financially, as a society, we are not going to be able to pay for the cost of health care for people. So beyond just trying to figure out what the name of the system is going to be, we have to figure out how are we going to tackle this problem, which is chronic, right? So it used to be that, you get sickness in 70s and 80s or maybe 60s, and you live for a couple of years and you die. Now people are in their 20s getting diabetes or even younger. You have endocrinology clinics opening up around the country for childhood obesity. That to me is just insanity, right? And so now you're talking about, okay, for the next 70 to 80 years, this is going to be a chronic disease that's going to cost massive amount of money. As a society, how are we going to pay for that? And I don't know the answer to that. You mentioned people in the military. 50% of applicants for the military cannot get in because they fail physical. 50%, right? And then you look at things like the opioid epidemic. Well, part of that, I think, is fueled by everything that we're talking about. Right, but then you're talking about a big segment of the population that should be part of the workforce that can't because they fail drug tests, because they're ODing or they're just not able to function. So all these things I think are intertwined, but yet we don't view it that way. We view it as isolated issues. And so I think just from a society standpoint, we have to get on top of this. We're ASAP.
And I think it comes back to the mindset issue when I was saying, guys, like, take what we say with a grain of salt and test it for yourself. Because what a lot of people do is they just go to their doctor and they say, oh, well, my doctor told me I need this medicine, and that's all I need to do. I don't need to change my diet.
Right.
You've probably heard that all the time. I have fortunately, a family member, was going through cancer chemo treatment, and the oncologist was like, "Oh no, you don't need to change your diet.
Right.
No, this is totally unrelated." It's like, well, the hip bone is connected to this.
Yeah,
you know the song that we all learned in kindergarten.
Right.
So that's what I really like to tell people: not to be a renegade and a problem child, but just always seek a second opinion. Always try to do the background research and customize things. And it's really scary stuff. Okay, one final question here. I like to tease out morning routines. I think for some people that can be a great time, because a lot of people say, I don't have money, I have no time for this. And you said you like to cluster your kind of biohacks in the morning. Yes. Is there a way to save time?
Yeah, so so background for me, so I have 3 little children. So I like to get my stuff done before they wake up, because once they wake up, it's chaos.
Yeah, they're great kids, by the way. They're so much fun.
They have so much energy, but so they're usually, so I get up early, and I never was a morning person, but I kind of force myself to get up early. Yeah. So I'm up at 5. I have started to implement certain things that we haven't talked about. So I do about 5 minutes of meditation in the morning. I wake up, I make sure I don't check my phone, which has been off in another room. So I wake up, do 5 minutes of meditation, which probably for me is the hardest thing. Yeah. I'm always going, and it's hard for me to slow down. But I've noticed that if I do that, I'm calmer, I'm able to focus better, and then I'll do some light exposure. So,
hold on. Is there a type of meditation that you like to use, or
I just do simple? I'm
just focus on your breath.
I focus on breath. Okay. I let thoughts come in. I acknowledge them, and I let them go. Yeah. And I'm building up to it. So that's probably the one I'm weakest at. Yeah. And, as human nature, we tend to focus on the ones that we're good at. Totally. And so I've made a conscious effort to really, really kind of drive that focus. And 5 minutes may not seem like a lot of time, but for me,
from 0 to 5,
for me, it's like torture. So I'm building up to it. But so I do that, and then I'll do some light exposure. So if it's light outside, which usually it's not, I'll go outside, get my feet on the ground, get grounded, allow the sun exposure for about 10 minutes. Right, get my eyes to see the light. If there is no, if it's dark out, I'll do the Juve light photobiomodulation, and I'll do about 20 minutes of that. Really, kind of just, it's amazing how energizing it is.
Oh my gosh!
Right, you get the light in your eyes, on your skin, you feel fantastic.
Right.
And then I will say that I've been fasted usually from about 6 p.m. the night before. So I try to not eat too late because of what I mentioned before about sleep interaction. And then what I'll do is I'll check things like my HRV, just my heart rate. I'll do fasting glucose, ketone checks, and then I'll usually will do a fasted workout. So I try to do about 30 minutes of lifting, 30 minutes of some sort of cardio that are more in intervals. Mm-hmm. I'll follow that up with a sauna session. So 20 minutes infrared sauna, try to burn through all whatever glycogen stores I have left. Get the mitochondrial boost. And then if I have time, I'll jump into the ice bath for about 20 minutes.
Nice.
If I don't have time, then I'll save that part for before bed. And as you mentioned before, I'll drop my temperature and kind of get that kind of calming sensation. And then from then on, I'll do a little bit of coffee, a little bit of MCT, a little bit of butter, and then I'm fasted for the day. And then my day consists of, usually it's, seeing clients, doing telemedicine stuff with them. If I'm traveling, doing interviews, writing, trying to do the social media, which reminds me, so the social media stuff and the emails, I've noticed that from a time efficiency standpoint, I've had to chunk it where I do it twice a day. So I'll do after I have my coffee, I'll do social media, email postings, or whatever I need to do, and then I'll turn it off. I'll physically click out of all the tabs for emails. I don't have on my phone social media, and so I don't have access to it because I found myself just kind of immersed in it. Totally. And obviously, from a business perspective, you have to be engaged, you have to be out there, but I have found that I waste a lot of time. And so I'm really starting to dedicate more time to the clients and writing a book and all the other things that I have to do throughout the day. Yeah. And then I try to chunk it so that I have about 3 hours of time with my children to really kind of engage with them. We're off of any technology. We're outdoors. We're playing. I want them to not be kind of controlled by technology too. And then dinner as a family. So we have dinner every night as a family if I'm there, where we're just talking about our day. Then we do some gratuity. So we'll say, three things we're grateful for. And the little ones, there's a 3-year-old, so he just says he's grateful for whatever, daddy. And the 6-year-old, she, usually comes up with the same 3 things. But it's just the idea of being mindful for what it takes to actually have food, and just as a family, I think it's good to disconnect and reconnect in terms of what's important.
Totally. That's awesome.
And then after that, I'm usually off technology, spending time with my wife and reading books.
Yeah. Do you read a lot of books or mostly like journal articles?
Both.
Yeah.
So I try to knock out, I've had filter systems kind of built into so that I can filter the kind of journal articles that I want to read. And then at night, I used to do my tablet, but I realized that it was affecting my sleep. So I've gone back to like real books.
Yeah.
And so I'll read usually books at that point, mostly on health topics, but also on different things that I'm interested in.
Yeah. That's key. Going back to the children, I mean, having those kind of rituals and things like that, like those 3 things that you're grateful for, those are things that like your kids are going to remember, after you're gone or potentially, right? So the holidays, like those little, it seems small, like, oh, we have dinner together as a family.
Right.
Like, why do we have to do that? We just order Uber Eats, or a kid eats on the soccer field or in the car.
Right.
But having those rituals established, that's, I've read and that's what I remember growing up.
Yep.
So I think it's really important for parents. And that's part of what's lost. I mean, we didn't talk about this, but meaning and purpose, connection.
Right.
A lot of us, we're eating keto, we're eating carnivore, whatever, but we're eating in the drive-through.
Right,
by ourselves
right.
while we're on our phones. We're not activating that whole cephalic phase of digestion. So all these things, they might sound a little fluffy, a little light.
But they're not, though. I mean, there are studies that look at if you are disengaged from what you're doing. So let's say you're eating, but you're watching TV. I mean, a lot of studies will show that like you will eat 50% more food just by the fact that you're disengaged from what you're doing. And I think for the children, I want them to be able to converse and have a conversation, talk about their days, express themselves without being tied to, either TV or iPad or something like that. And obviously, this is something we work at.
Yeah.
It's not easy. We might be talking about, this is what we do, but the reality is it's a battle.
Something spills.
Oh yeah, it's a
breaks.
battle.
Yeah.
I mean, you're constantly battling, but it's just something where my wife and I have said, this is something that's important to us. We want to instill this in our children. And as I said, when they're 18, they might be like, see you, Dad.
Yeah.
You're kind of crazy. I'm going to go off and do my thing. But regardless, I think they've had that basis for 18 years where they understand the importance, or at least we feel the importance of having connections with people, having good nutrition, taking care of themselves. And so I think it's going to be hopefully lasting with them.
Totally. I hope for that too. I mean, Inez could just go out on a binge and whatever, but I think their baseline is going to be higher.
Yes.
So they're going to dabble. I mean, they dabble at school because everyone's eating junk food or, Halloween parties or whatever. But they start to realize, well, I don't feel as good, or I crave that. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So my son, obviously he takes the brunt of it because he's the oldest, but he'll go to birthday parties and he used to kind of like get made fun of, and that would be very difficult to deal with. And so we would say, okay, go ahead, have what you want. And he would inevitably have a severe, bellyache and have diarrhea and be embarrassed. And now when he has a birthday party, he'll grab like one thing and then he'll stop himself. And so that's without us saying, hey, you shouldn't eat this stuff. And so part of it, I think, as a parent, if you're basically telling your children, you cannot do this, they're going to rebel, right? Yeah. But if you're educating them and you're also leading by example, so you're not being a hypocrite saying, oh, you should not eat this, but meanwhile you're sneaking in the back room, then, they're smart. They're going to realize, that you're being a hypocrite. So it's really about giving them the education, right? And to me, I mean, it might seem like, wow, this is way off. Like, what is this guy talking about? But it's pretty simple. Like, if I were to tell you, hey, your 8-year-old shouldn't drink alcohol, you would probably say, yeah, you're probably right. Well, I really don't think there's much difference in terms of nutrition. You're doing, if you look at basically a schematic of what happens to the liver when you drink alcohol, and then what happens to the liver when you drink fructose, basically sugar, sodas, there's no difference, right? And so the question then becomes, is there really a moral equivalence? Well, I think if you're a child and drinking basically fructose all day, then you're going to have the same issues. You probably shouldn't be doing that. So,
Right.
You know,
That's a great point. I haven't heard that comparison, but
yeah.
that research is pretty crazy about how alcohol and fructose are related to the liver. Dr. John, it's been awesome connecting with you.
Yeah,
we have
definitely.
so many comments, guys.
Hopefully good, guys.
I'm going to go through these and address your questions, comments, and so forth later. We're going to eat dinner here in a few hours and stuff. We'll talk about these and address these. But super grateful that you're all here. If you enjoyed this content, if you like these live streams, just hit that like button. That just lets us know that we'll do more content like that. Definitely follow John. You have a great YouTube channel. You're on Instagram, Facebook. Is it all the same handle?
Yeah, Biohack MD is the major one, and then John Limansky MD is the personal one. So yeah.
And Limansky, L-I-M.
Limansky.
For some reason, I always put L-E-M. So when you type in Limansky, it's L-I-M.
It gets butchered.
Yeah.
But
awesome. Really appreciate you coming on, bud. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
A lot of fun.
Thanks, guys.
And guys, the links are below in the description if you're watching the replay as well. That we talked about the course and the new book coming out. I think you can pre-order it?
Yeah, I think pre-order is going up soon. It's going to be called Keto Plus. And I think they're working on getting the pre-order stuff.
Cool.
Hopefully soon. So
it's going to launch in the fall, right?
It's going to launch spring, I think, of next year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know why I was thinking fall. So you got some time still.
Don't push me on the time.
Yeah.
I still got to write it.
Too funny.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, guys.
All right.
We'll connect with you later.
Cheers.